Welcome to today's IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. Just as Europe appeared finally to have solved its decades-long problem of high unemployment and low employment, our continent faces major new challenges. A halting of productivity growth and, surely not unrelated, the failure to generate rapidly growing startup firms in the high-growth sectors of the future means that many EU economies are stagnating. This is happening against a transformed geopolitical backdrop as Europe rearms and refocuses on economic security. Ideas matter too. 50 years ago, state intervention became unfashionable and free markets were in vogue. In the past half-decade or so, views on the role of the state and markets have shifted again for reasons we'll discuss presently. For the EU, this has meant an ongoing rethinking of some of its core competences: trade, state aid rules, and competition policy. We're joined today to discuss the rethinking that's happening and what outcomes it could produce in the future. Elvire Fabry of the Delors Institute, Martin Sandbu of the Financial Times, and Sander Tordoir of the Centre for European Reform are joining us today. Thank you all, folks, for joining us. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and thanks to our audience for tuning in as well. We'll start with a round of questions on those three competences and what our panelists think has changed in trade, state aid rules, and competition policy, and what's driving those changes up until now. And maybe, Elvire, could we start with you on trade policy issues?
Yes, hello, Dan, and thank you very much for this, the invitation to have this interesting discussion. What has changed about trade policy? A lot. Not so much because, as some have called it, we were experimenting deglobalization, because what we see now is rather longer value chains and a sort of reshuffling of globalization because of the geopolitical concerns that we are confronted with. So it means rather a slowdown of global trade, of globalization, but not deglobalization. So how the EU is managing with that new situation? Now we have a trade policy that is closely intertwined with two major factors, which is decarbonization on one side and economic security on the other side. Decarbonization, the Europeans are deeply engaged with that objective, and they have this supplementary constraint to comply today with some due diligence, with some new regulations, which means that their supply throughout the world needs to be more coherent with those objectives. And this happens precisely at a moment when the global trade is much more complex, with all the implications of the confrontation between the US and China, with the European market, which is more and more squeezed between a US market which is more closed and a Chinese market which intends to increase its dependence, the dependence of the rest of the world to its supplies. So it's really a moment of adjustment of the European trade policy. And if we look back at the legacy of the outcoming European Commission, we can notice some very interesting changes, notably on the side of economic security, with the adoption of the new autonomous trade defense tools. But we now have a toolbox. How are we going to use it? We're just at the beginning, and there we see that we're facing an additional challenge, which is the lack of cohesion of the member states, because trade policy is much more intertwined as well with industrial policy, with a bigger role of the state, and that's where it takes us more back to more centrifugal forces in the EU, with a bigger role of the member states, with the increasing risk of divisions and different point of views. And notably, the member states are not exposed the same way to global trade, are not exposed to the same way to the Chinese market, and tend to have very different views on how we need to adjust this trade policy.
Could I ask you a follow-up on a topical question in terms of the decision last week to put very high tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles? What's your view on that, also in the context of the EU's efforts to decarbonize?
The Commission has been very cautious. I think it has calibrated some tariffs that preserve the access to the European market, to the Chinese OEMs. And it says something precisely about the way we want to try to calibrate that de-risking strategy, because the 27 have agreed on the de-risking strategy, but what it means remains to be explored and to be much more pragmatic. And behind those tariffs, there's a whole strategy that needs to be built concerning also FDI, because the whole purpose of those tariffs was rather to incentivize the Chinese OEMs to invest in the EU rather than to import. But how do can we grasp the whole benefits of this FDI? It requires much more strategic thinking and maybe to think about some innovative conditionality. But we can go back on that.
Yeah, because of the FDI, it looks like Turkey and Hungary are two of the countries China is looking to invest in those areas. But let's come back to that. Martin, your thoughts on what's happening, the EU collective and individual member state views on tariffs, on subsidies, excuse me.
Yes, the EU has a quite strange tradition, strange in the sense of unusual in a global context, tradition on state aid, which is to be quite constricted and restrictive on it. And there's a good historical reason for this. The whole single market was set up and designed in part to try to avoid different European countries underbidding one another with state aid, attracting investments into one European country instead of another European country, and so on. So state aid, like competition policy, has for a long time been set up at the European level in order to prevent any kind of unfair competition, one country undermining another. And it's worked very well, right? The EU is a competitive economy in the sense that you don't have so much of this sort of inefficient and unfair subsidy policy that you might have feared. That's the history, right? But we've had many shocks, but I'd like to think of two big shocks in recent years that are shocks to the political thinking ultimately, even though they're also economic shocks. So one is the crisis of COVID and then the energy crises, which necessitated a lot of public support for companies. So you got a suspension of the standard state aid restrictions in the European rules, so governments could go ahead and help their companies. That was absolutely necessary to deal with the lockdowns and also to help them through the unprecedented energy crisis. But I think it kind of changed a bit the thinking. We were doing it again. We also saw the problems. We maybe were reminded the reasons why we needed state aid rules, because in practice, the governments with the deepest pockets spent the most money. Germany, above all, accounted for most of the state aid spending, or at least the committed state aid in the COVID crisis. The other shock to the politics of state aid, again through an economic shock, was the industrial policy advances of both China and the US. China, we've seen it in particular in electric vehicles, but green tech generally, and a lot of the other industries. For the US, we've seen it with the Inflation Reduction Act. I think the sort of very boiled down lesson of both of those experiences in Europe has been China and the US have shown that subsidies work. They work in the sense that if you throw enough money at an industry, you can build it up. So EVs in China, or all this factory construction we know is happening in the US. So all of this has changed the political economy and the politics and even the kind of political psychology, I think, around the state aid debate in Europe. Now, the actual policy framework hasn't changed all that much yet. We had a suspension in the crisis. We have, some tweaking and a lot of promises about thinking further about how to make the state aid regime more fit for purpose, where the idea of what the purpose is may be changing. But I'll round off these introductory remarks by just pointing out, I think there are a number of dilemmas or difficulties we are facing as we try to reshape or update the state aid policy. One dilemma, or at least a sort of question mark, is Europe doesn't actually subsidize that much less than the US, at least, maybe a bit less than China. But we subsidize in different ways. We subsidize mostly at national level, so the subsidies themselves are fragmented. There isn't a European level of taxation, and tax policy is a national competency, so we can't do EU-wide tax credits like the US Inflation Reduction Act did. So we are learning something about ways of doing subsidization where our ways, the European ways, seem to have been less efficient, perhaps in the sense of promoting industrial policy. So that's one question mark. Another dilemma is that there are different views of and not easily compatible views between member states of the EU how to do subsidization. So there are a group of countries that are generally skeptical of subsidies and industrial policy. That's typically the sort of Nordic liberal wing of countries. Ireland is a little bit in that group. There are the big countries that are quite happy to do subsidies. Germany, France, although France is sort of feeling the squeeze of its budgetary problems. And then you have countries that would very much like to subsidize but don't feel they have the money. And so these three groups have very different ideas, where one says, well, maybe we should try to keep a pretty traditional state aid restrictions framework. The second group saying, well, let's subsidize, let's do it. And the third saying, well, we should do it, but if countries do it by themselves, then Germany will outcompete everybody else because they have much deeper pockets. I mean, this was something you saw in the COVID crisis, and that actually led to the political momentum for the recovery fund and the common borrowing for that. So this is a big worry that the single market could fragment. So that group of countries insists on subsidies at the European level, bigger EU budget. Then, of course, you get into the objections of the net contributing states. And that leads me to the third dilemma, then I'll finish off, which is that because of the way the world is changing and the reinvigoration of a view that governments need to have at least some guiding role in industrial policy, there are a group of countries, these Nordic liberals, that I think are facing dilemmas they didn't face before. They tend to be fiscal hawks and trade and subsidy liberals, but they also tend to be environmentally concerned and want to do a green transition. They also tend to be defense hawks, which means spend more money on defense, which is, separate, but also involves some industrial policy in defense manufacturing, for example. So you're seeing this northern flank, I think, coming up against the dilemma that, well, I mean, if you want the transition and the sort of structural shift you care about, it's not clear that you can hold on to the frugal view of budget and European spending that you did before. I think Ireland will find itself facing some of those dilemmas as we get closer to the next European budget negotiations. So all of these things belong together. State aid is a particular policy area, but it links up with all these other things.
Absolutely. So just on the subsidies issue, I sometimes wonder if in Europe during COVID in particular, did subsidies actually go too far, that we kept businesses in business that really shouldn't have been in business? One of the reasons why we've got very high employment rates at the moment. And that has prevented a reallocation of resources into higher growing sectors. So we've kept businesses, inefficient businesses in business, and that's contributed to the productivity problem.
Well, I think it is possible to make that case in the sense that since pandemic, we have seen much faster productivity growth in the US and probably some more reallocation there than in Europe. It's not clear that that's the same reallocation as is needed for the big transitions, industrial policy related transitions that are the longer term goal here. So in a sense, one could be true and the other not. I think what this comes down to is not so much do you do state aid, do you do subsidies, but what is it you subsidize? And in particular, do you direct your subsidies towards keeping old industries alive, or do you direct subsidies towards accelerating a structural change away from the old structures towards new structures? I mean, from an economic point of view, it's quite clear that the latter is preferable. From a political point of view, it means that you're accelerating something that's already painful and often resisted. We could talk here about the German automotive industry, for example.
I'm sure we'll come back to that. Sander, your opening thoughts on how the competition space has changed in Europe?
Yeah, thanks so much. Maybe I start briefly with what has changed to complement what Martin was saying. So you've had, in a sense, three major shocks to what you might call the Washington consensus. I sometimes call it the Brussington consensus, because in some respects, the EU setup doubled down on this model of being very open to trade, very restrictive on state aid, and very strict on mergers and acquisitions. So, and Martin laid them out perfectly. It's the shock from losing access to Russian energy. It's the shock from the US going big for green with the Inflation Reduction Act, triggering lots of jitters in Europe about losing the race for green tech manufacturing, probably unjustifiably, because the American market remains open for Europe and is more shielded to China. So it's actually pulling in quite a lot of production from Europe. And then the third shock is China's successful industrial policy, as well as the macro dimension of the Chinese economy basically unbalancing after the real estate bubble popped, and there was very large excess savings in China being redirected into manufacturing. So you have these three shocks, but I wanted to mention one, I think, more benign and positive takeaway from all of this that Martin alluded to, which is that there has been a rethinking about a larger crisis that all of us face on this earth, which is the climate crisis. And I think there the sense that we can only rely on carbon pricing, which was to some extent the consensus for a long time, that's gone a bit out of the window. And there's a sense that you cannot only price, but you also have to create, what you might call sort of the price elasticity of demand. So you can build EVs, but if you don't build charging stations, consumers will not actually switch over to the new sectors that we want. So I think subsidies have a useful role to play in creating these types of new sectors, and some of them are very important for climate. On the competition space, maybe call me a bit orthodox, but I think this call for creating larger firms in Europe to compete with larger firms in the US and China is always a bit risky, because we know that the European single market is still relatively fragmented. And so one of the risks by creating European champions, by loosening basically curbs on mergers, is that you create very large firms that are chieftains and have kingdoms of their own, because they don't actually experience competition from other firms in their sector across the border. And so there is that question of, do you put the horse and the cart in the wrong way? And should you actually be doing the really difficult stuff as Europe, which is to break down barriers in the single market, in services, in the capital market, etc., such that firms can organically grow into a larger size because the market size and the demand is there. Now, I think there are two caveats to that story, and I think Mario Draghi makes a relatively compelling case for two exceptions. So one is, he makes the case that there may be specific industries where scale really matters, even in the short run, and Europe would be harming itself by not looking at things like innovation when they consider mergers. So to not only look at pricing and the consumer impact, but to also take into account the sort of innovation and scale economies in that space. The other caveat he brings is that Europeans need to be more aware of sort of economic security considerations when they look at mergers and acquisitions. And he makes this proposal for pushing that out of DG Comp and having a separate body look at that, which I think those two dimensions are useful avenues for further research, although I'm not particularly a competition expert myself, but just looking at it as a EU expert more generally, those would be my reflections.
Right, thank you. Yeah, interesting observation on all of that. In terms of this is a question to anyone, and one I don't know the answer to. That Draghi in his report said he believes that the wording of the treaty is sufficiently flexible to allow considerable changes to competition policy. Would anybody disagree with him on that and think that it may require treaty change to introduce things like the innovation defense that you mentioned, Sander, for companies merging on the basis that they need scale even in the short term?
Well, I don't know. I would think that Draghi's team did their legal homework on that, so there's probably a decent amount of leeway under the treaties to reinterpret some of these clauses. Where I think, you know, and my colleagues and I have written a report on the Draghi sort of argument, and where we were more critical is on the telecoms example, which somehow always emerges. Because if you think of Europe's technology challenge, what really drives productivity gains is if smaller and medium-sized firms actually adopt the latest technologies quickly. And most European firms are actually consumers of telecoms in that sense, right? They need access to digital networks at an affordable rate in order to bring home, for example, cloud computing services or other services that increase their productivity. And so having higher pricing and more concentration of firms in the telecom space, I think, comes with a real trade-off for all these small and medium firms in Europe that then pay a higher price, which in turn may impede their ability to adopt new technologies, which is where the sort of broad economy-wide productivity gains may be. So on the telecoms example, I think, you know, there are some real questions around Draghi's argument. If you think of, you know, the Alstom-Siemens merger, this sort of large train companies that's more in global competition with very large Chinese firms, and scale seems to matter. Maybe, you know, maybe that's a different case. So I think on a case-by-case basis, these things have to be thought through rather carefully.
Okay, good. And on that merger, Elvire, to come back to you, do you have a view on whether that merger should have been allowed to go ahead? The Alstom Siemens train merger, did you support that? If you had a view on that, and just more generally, strategic autonomy is very much a French invention, I suppose. Would you like to interpret what strategic autonomy means from your perspective?
Well, yeah, let me jump first on strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy, yes, it was coming, let's say, from, I mean, the narrative came from Paris, came from Emmanuel Macron, and it has morphed in a way. It was transformed. We had many years. We spent a lot of time discussing if it's about strategic autonomy or economic sovereignty, what it means, what it implies. The whole purpose of that shift in the European approach is to reduce excessive dependencies, to avoid the weaponization of trade flows, and I think that the evolution of once again the evolution of the international framework has accelerated the European thinking. And it was interesting to see that beyond the expression of open strategic autonomy, willing to keep a European market open, but equipping itself to protect the European interest, what followed was the attempt to develop a European doctrine of economic security, which could also be called open economic security. And that's where the Europeans really differentiate themselves from the US approach, which is leading really to close the US market. We will see how it goes on after the US elections, but the direction is really to have that very protectionist approach. And on the EU side, as I was mentioning before, some member states, and notably Germany, is really depending highly on the Chinese demand. Some European companies have the benefits in China representing as high as 40% as the global benefits. And at the moment, we currently see a divide between the member states, and also between some sectors of the industry, or between SMEs and big companies, between two strategies. One which would be to be a sort of a firefighter, trying to grasp the most benefit they can grasp, can grasp from China, independently from the need to reduce excessive dependency to China, and the others who would like to bet more on an industrial policy, increasing domestic capabilities. But to go back to what Martin was saying about state aids, it's not only I mean, I completely share his point of view, but it's not only about the ceilings, the pipe, how we channel those subsidies. It's really how what is the strategy behind, and what are the targets? And if you just focus on the EV issue, it's the question is not so much, do we need to support OEMs? We need to have very specific objectives, increasing the demand in the EU. So is it about rather going into the direction of subsidizing consumption rather than production? And what we need is charging infrastructure. It's to help the SMEs, all the T1, T2, T3 suppliers to engage in the shift towards electrification. So it really needs, I mean, we really need to have a much more clear industrial strategy behind. And currently the autonomy, strategic autonomy, and now what we are focusing more on, economic security, needs to be based also on a more clear selection. Yes, Mario Draghi launched an interesting argument, saying we have to make a selection, because we cannot all protect or support all industrial sectors, and we need to bet much more on innovation. So the focus should be much more on research and development, our innovation capacity. And when you compare all the investment that have been that were made in the US and in the EU during the past 10 years, you see that the US have been investing much more in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, while in the EU, a large part of that investment continue to go to the automotive industry. Well, that may be there may be really a strategic mistake in not trying to anticipate much more where we have the technological breakthrough that will be indispensable if we don't want to increase our dependencies on the US or China.
Martin, just to pick up on that point Elvire made about European investment, a huge amount of R&D investment goes into the auto industry. Is it possible that the whole auto industry is now at risk in Europe, that we've missed the EV boat, and the entire industry is going to shrink, and we don't have other high innovation sectors that are automatically going to emerge? Again, as Elvire said, the US is really taking the lead in AI. So are things really, are they as bleak for Europe as Mario Draghi hinted at in his report?
Look, I kind of want to answer yes and no. In a sense, I think the bleakness can be a bit overdone, including how we don't appreciate the things that Europe does do well in green tech, in particular. Actually, on patenting, the ECB's executive board member Isabel Schnabel had a good speech a couple of weeks ago, pointing out that in green tech the EU leads on patenting, actually. But it's still, we're still buying more and more EVs from China. Look, you said, will new sectors not appear automatically? Well, no, I don't think they'll appear automatically necessarily. And this goes to the kind of big topic of today's webinar, that we can't perhaps just sit back and let the free market deal with things just like we used to or thought we could. That doesn't mean we have to go become either Chinese or Bidenomics-like in our approach. But I think it does mean that, in particular, among economists and in the more kind of traditionally liberal flank of the EU, we may need to become a little bit more comfortable with some idea of planning, in the sense of having some view of the direction the economy is heading. Which direction does structural change take, and what are the policies we do to steer that? And then the debate should be about how much, and which instruments, and so on. But I think we do need to, at a very sort of top level, in a very top level sense, need to be comfortable talking about which direction we'd like the economy to see the economy going. Now, on EV specifically, look, I think one thing that China proves is that you can go from being behind to being at the technological frontier in very little time, right? I mean, China basically said, hey, this is a growing industry, let's be at the forefront of it, and they did it. Now, we don't have the same political and policy tools as China, and we're not going to choose to do it in the same way anyway. But I certainly think there are ways of getting out of the current funk. What's the cause of the current funk? Well, in my view, it's that European car makers don't really feel certain that the demand will be there for a large number of electric vehicles made by them. I think it's, in a way, you strip a lot of stuff away. That's it, right? They could invest in a gigacasting factory, but are you going to do that if you see that the demand for EVs is sort of tapering off? Who knows how many people will buy it and at which price and so on. But there are policies we can use to change that. Supposedly by 2035, we will not buy a single, a car with tailpipe emissions, right? I think that the specific rule is it has to be 100% zero emissions cars, and there's some debate about what exactly counts as zero emissions. But Europeans or citizens of the EU buy 10 million cars every year. 10 million cars, so about a fifth of that, maybe around 2 million now, are EVs. About 400,000 of those are Chinese. 4% of all the cars, right? So it's not as if there should be a lack of demand. If we really meant it, that in 11 years' time, there'll be 10 million EVs bought every year in Europe, then there's plenty of market for European car makers to lean into. So somehow they don't seem certain of that. That, I think, is largely politicians' fault. So there are things we can do. We can break down this goal and say, well, it'll be 10 million, all of them, by 2035. By 2029, it should be 4 million. And make that very clear. Well, then people will make those cars to sell. Use procurement policies, taxation policies to create demand for these. In Germany, more than half of all new cars are actually bought for the corporate fleet. There's a tax treatment or corporate car purchases. That has recently been made a little bit worse for EVs, if I understand it right. It certainly isn't good enough. You can rebalance that to basically make it nonsensical for German corporates to buy fossil fuel cars and make it very attractive to buy electric cars. Are they all going to buy Chinese cars? No, they won't, because German corporates want European or German cars for their executives, even if they're electric. But in any case, there are policy tools you could use to create a market for European EV car makers, even without locking out the Chinese ones. One example of that, and then I'll give it back to you. Last year, France had a very nice policy to allow subsidize people to lease an EV for 100 euros a month, and up. But apparently you could get down to 100 euros a month. It was very popular. It had a clever little piece of the policy that said it has to have a certain maximum carbon footprint, this car. And that, in effect, meant that only European cars qualified. It was super popular, so popular that they decided they had to stop it because they were spending more money on it than they wanted to. But that sort of policy is available to us, right? At a European level, even. So I've just given you two very simple examples. Use the taxation policies for corporate car purchases and use general procurement or subsidy policies with a carbon footprint in them. And you could be halfway there, but you kind of have to want it and decide it, and you probably have to want to and decide it together at a European level.
Okay, good, good. Just coming back to something you said earlier, Martin, that about the US industrial policy. I'm kind of the view that it's a bit early to say how successful it's been. If you look at semiconductors, you look at the state of Intel. Despite Intel being given huge subsidies by the German government, it stopped going ahead with the plant in Germany, and Intel is in big trouble. Our subsidies, is there a risk that we go from the kind of free market, anti-subsidies, anti-industrial policy, and we go too far the other direction, thinking that all we need to do is spend, and that'll solve our problems? And I put that in the context also of the COVID borrowing that took place in Europe, the next generation EU funding. How successful would you evaluate that at this early stage?
I'll try to be quick since I spoke at length in the previous question, but the risk is absolutely there. I agree with that. And it kind of comes back to the sort of simple point of, don't spend it stupidly, right? Europe already subsidizes in terms of quantum as much as the US does, public subsidies. So it's not that we're not subsidizing, that they are out subsidizing us. It's that we do it differently. We need to think about how and what we spend public subsidy on. Maybe more would be good, but it has to be spent on things that work. Now, I think on the IRA, I think in one sense, it's incontrovertible that it has had an effect in that you see factory construction, the CHIPS Act and the IRA, sorry, both of them. And there's no doubt in the data that the actual capital put into building physical factories, it has about doubled since those schemes were put in place. And it's at way higher levels than ever recorded in the US as a share of GDP. So in that sense, it's working. Is it going to actually create a lot of frontier chips or a new green tech industry? Well, that remains to be seen. But at least the factories are being built, and we can't say that in Europe. So they're doing something right or not. Is it something we can replicate? They are making something happen. And I think we should think hard about how we make something happen here. On the RRF, the Resilience and Recovery Fund, look, I think it's too soon to say whether it has long-term structural effects. Does it actually contribute to the digital and green transition? But I think we can say that it has a short-term macroeconomic effect in that you see the largest recipients actually doing quite well in terms of growth. And I think some of that you can put down to the boost to investment spending and just inflows, macroeconomic inflows that have boosted their economies.
Sander, maybe a similar question to you in terms of what your views on that EU COVID borrowing and spending, how effective that's been. What do you see as a model for the future?
Can I just pick up to complement Martin's points? So I think Martin is totally right that the French consumer subsidy scheme for EVs was extremely elegant. And it's surprising to me that, first of all, they get rid of the scheme again. In Germany, they got rid of their EV subsidies on the consumer side, mind you, because of the debt brake. So in our two largest economies, we have complete zigzag policy on creating a stable long-term demand pool for, what is arguably Germany's, or actually not arguably, what is clearly Germany's most important sector. And so I would ideally see an EU directive that all member states that do these kinds of subsidy schemes for EVs or for other green tech products like heat pumps or green hydrogen, that they have similar clauses built in, for example, on footprint or on social standards and how they're built, classic European values, if you will, which then de facto act as a buy European clause. And then you can tweak them to make them available for allies like Japan or the US, right? So I think that kind of thinking is, in a way, what Draghi is promoting when he's saying, you're already doing industrial policy, you're just all over the place. Sort of get your act together, EU. So that's just one thought I had, building on what Martin was saying. On the RRF, I would say the original goal that we often don't discuss about was that it was meant to stabilize the Eurozone economy during the massive pandemic recession. And in a sense, that sat very awkwardly with the design of the instrument because it's an investment fund and investment slow. You know, if you really want to stabilize the economy, you work with tax breaks, or you work with, you know, checks to households. But in a sense, I do think that initial phase, it kind of worked, because the two moments when you saw spreads and yields coming down in the Eurozone were first the purchase announcement from the ECB, and the second big decline was Merkel and Macron going for a big common fiscal response, which then morphed into what we now call in EU jargon, the next generation EU, right? So yeah, I think that in turn enabled national fiscal policy to do a lot more stabilization than what we did, for example, in the Euro crisis. And so I think in that first inning of the fund, you know, it was definitely a success. And I don't think we should completely forget that when we now read a headline of some project somewhere not being particularly useful or even subject to corruption. But that larger question of, is it triggering real reforms? Is it triggering, you know, real productive public investment, I think is still out in the open. What is striking is that in the pre-pandemic phase, we had this European semester to coordinate policies, and member states would get recommendations to reform their labor market or put their pension system on a more sustainable footing. And the implementation rate was abysmal, right? It was usually below 10%. If you look at the implementation rate of milestones under the RRF, where the Commission has real money that they can block if a country doesn't kind of get its act together, it's already above 20%, and it's just over a few years. So I think there's some hopeful signs that it might be triggering some reforms at least.
Okay, good. We certainly don't have enough time to delve deeper, so I'm going to give the last question to you, Elvire, in terms of what could come down the line in terms of trade wars. The response of China to the EV tariffs, do you see that as being quite limited? I'm much more interested to hear what you think Europe will do if Trump puts across-the-board tariffs on everything we sell to the United States. What do you think Brussels and the EU, how do you think they would respond to that? Elvire, you're muted.
Yes, until now, China was quite cautious in the way it was responding to not only to the European measures, but before that to the US measures, because it has complained at the WTO level against the ban on export ships from the US or ships technologies, but there was not very. There was no strong response in Beijing, and now it's rather a sort of strategic response, because it is not hurting that much, because it's if we're talking about the brandies, it's a very limited sector, but it's a very political measure, because it is the objective is really to divide the Europeans, and also to send a signal to the luxury sector, which is highly dependent on the Chinese demand. So we are still in a phase of dialogue, trying to see how we can condition our interdependence upon some economic security criteria. And for the Europeans, in a way, the objective would be to secure some supply. And once again, the idea is not to close the European markets to the Chinese imports. And now, notably, we are very clear view that we also need to have access to the Chinese technologies to learn from China. And the same way they have imposed some technological transfer with the European companies investing in China. Maybe now we have to think the other way around and think how we can try to benefit from those the advance in technologies, not only keeping an access to the technological hub in China, but also avoiding to have Chinese companies importing all the components and having their own Chinese suppliers, and in the end controlling their supply chain to assemble in the EU, like for the EVs, but also also working with some European suppliers and allowing also to have some technological transfers to those suppliers. So yes, there's a risk of escalation, and the Europeans are really once again calibrating the response. And the escalation could come also with the unilateral decisions coming from Washington. Because if we end with the second mandate, Republican mandate with Donald Trump, if he is able to implement his tariffs, not only on China, which would increase the need to access to the European market for the Chinese companies, but also the famous 10 to 20% on across the board on all imports. What could be the European response? First, unilateral response, and the DG Trade is working on that to prepare a sort of package of higher tariffs on some US imports comparable to the, comparable to the costs, the impact that it would have on the EU. But it could also use all those new defensive tools. If in addition to that, the investments made through the IRA are increasing the competitiveness of US exports, and it creates imbalances in the single market. So the foreign subsidy control could be used, as well as the reciprocity in public procurement. I mean, we have some tools. The problem is really rather the political support and the cohesion of the 27. And on that aspect, we are very late, because the feeling that we have is that at the moment we have some member states which are much more inward looking and focus on the budgetary constraint, like France, or on other issues, but not anticipating enough how they're going to coordinate between themselves, the same way they did it like in the time of Brexit, and we had that sort of a very close connection and coordination between the Commission and the member states, and between the member states themselves.
Good. Thank you, all three of you, for that. A bit of a cliche to say that we've only scratched the surface, but I think we really have today. But many useful thoughts and perspectives from all three of you. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks our audience for being on this as well. So good afternoon to everyone. Thanks again.